Greetings, dear friends, fellow programmers, and those aspiring to be. Today, I have a bit different lesson. Now that we have covered and discussed a lot of different aspects of dependency injection in ASP.NET Core, I would like to share some insights with you about the way that ASP.NET Core and its compiler and engine are basically disposing of unused resources or resources whose lifetime has expired and giving us the flexibility to use those resources for some other processes. Possessing knowledge and deep understanding of these underlying concepts can improve your knowledge as a developer and improve the performance of your code significantly, because you will be able to make informed decisions and write your code in such a way to ensure that all the resources are handled properly, lifetimes are defined as well in a proper manner, that way making your application way better performing and that way way more scalable. Basically, by being familiar with and utilizing these good practices and being informed about proper resource management techniques, you can increase the performance, reduce the overhead and unnecessary resource utilization in every application you build. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. If you do not apply these techniques and do not have deep understanding of these concepts of resource management, you will probably stumble upon issues in your application, even though ASP.NET Core and .NET Framework in general already have mechanisms for resource management already put in place and automatically freeing up the resources and managing them for you, but those are as smart as somebody's made them. So in some cases, your concrete needs might vary from what is defined in the core logic of the disposal mechanisms. Now, do you remember our initial reference to a robot with a toolbox? When I was just getting started with the series with dependency injection, we said that robot is basically some service that is using different kinds of services in order to be able to perform tasks. And those dependencies, services necessary to robot to function properly, can be observed as a toolbox containing all the knowledges and functionalities that the service we are working with, I'm talking about robot, needs in order to be able to do what we expect from it. Well, this reference is back. And this time, we need to be very careful about lifetimes of the toolbox and specific tools inside of that toolbox, because our robot can get exhausted from carrying unnecessary tools for too long. Just imagine having to bring a whole toolbox filled with different tools you no longer need, and you still have to carry it. Well, it's the same thing with poorly defined lifetimes of services in our applications. As we already covered in previous videos, in ASP.NET Core, our services have one of the 3 lifetimes. I'm talking about Transient, Scoped, and Singleton. And basically, if you're not familiar with these concepts, I highly recommend you to go back to those videos, go through the flows of learning everything about them, and then come back here, because this is kinda the rooftop of our house and the lifetimes are the base of the house. So you have to know the base in order to be able to build the roof. So I'm waiting for you here to come back with all the necessary knowledges acquired. And welcome back. It is time to get started with transient services. You can think of them as mayflies. They are very short-lived and always fresh. It is exactly the same with transient services. Every time you request a transient lifetime service, a new instance of that service is going to be newed up for you, and you will be able to use it. So no states will be stored, you will always get a fresh, new instance of a service. Then we have scoped services. These services are like seasonal workers. You have an instance and you use it across a single request. After the request was handled properly, the instance gets disposed, and after that, when it's requested in another request, you create a new instance of it. And finally, we have Singleton services. These services are being instantiated once when we get started with the execution of our application, or if you want to implement lazy loading, they get instantiated when you first time want to use them, and they get used across the entire lifespan of our application. So as long as your application is running, you are using the same instance of a service. Of course, unless you have restarted the server or you have uploaded a new version of the application, so you have to restart it, or something like that. But basically, as long as you're not playing around with the server, you will be using the same exact instance of your service. Now that we know that, let us discuss the disposal of those services. After all, I'm sure you are familiar with the importance of disposing unnecessary, unused resources whose lifespan has already expired. Because if we were not disposing of those services, we would end up with memory leaks. We would get our stacks filled very quickly, even in not so complex applications. And we do not want that. We want to use very complex, robust applications and have them run for as long as we want them without ever running out of resources. So basically, in our programming languages, we need a mechanism that is going to dispose all of the unnecessary services. But now a question arises. How does this work? How is this happening? To answer this question, we need first to learn tracking mechanisms. For example, ASP.NET Core uses iServiceProvider and iServiceScope interfaces and their concrete implementations for tracking and managing lifetimes of our services, as well as their disposal, of course. When the iServiceProvider creates a new instance of a service, it kind of knows what is the lifetime in that service, so it starts tracking it, and it is very careful about the time and point in our application when the lifetime of that service has expired and it needs to be disposed of. Now, for example, let's discuss each lifetime and how it gets managed. So when it comes to transient services, they are not tracked by iServiceProvider. That is because it is a very simple situation. We know that every time a service is requested, we need to build a new instance of it, and basically as soon as we do what we want to do with it, we know that it should be disposed of. So basically their lifetime is defined by the consuming code. Then we have scoped services, and they are tracked by iServiceScope. Each iServiceScope tracks a few of the scoped services and makes sure that their lifetime is equal to the request that is being handled. And finally, we have Singleton lifetime. When it comes to Singleton, it is being tracked by iServiceProvider, as we already mentioned, and it is responsible for their tracking or eventual disposing when we gracefully want to shut our application down. And now that we are completely familiar with the tracking process, it is time to start discussing the actual disposing of our services. So again, we will get things going from our transient services. And as you already know, for each transient service, we are cleaning them up and disposing of them after their usage is done. So you can think of it as a party, and when each guest leaves a party, we clean after them. So after a guest has left, we go through all the things they moved, they made dirty, or they destroyed. We clean those things up, and when they're gone, everything is clean after them. But for all other guests, we're not touching anything. And when they leave, then we clean after them. So basically, the consuming service is responsible for the dismissal and disposal of all the transient services they need in order to function properly. Of course, since each instance is going to be short-lived, code requesting it is going to be responsible for its disposal, even more so if this service that is responsible for the service we want to define as transient implements iDisposable interface. And then we come to scoped services. Now, here the situation is a bit different. We are bound to a single HTTP request, and after this request is handled, then we dispose of all the scoped services dedicated to that request. So you can think of it as a huge weekend party, and when that party is over, that is when we are going to clean and tidy up everything. So basically, in reality, when a new request is created, and this instance of iService scope is responsible for that particular request. As soon as this request is properly handled and everything is executed, the instance of iService scope gets disposed of. All the services assigned to that iService scope get marked for disposal as well. And finally, we have our Singleton services. These services have way longer lifespans, and if we want to use our music festival reference, it would be something like having a huge music festival and we clean things up after everything is done. When the festival is over and everything is dusted, that is when we dispose of our Singleton services. So basically, how this works is iService provider tracks all the Singleton services, and when we gracefully shut our application down, it marks all of them for disposal and basically disposes all the services that inherit from iDisposable interface. To wrap things up, when you master these concepts, your application will first of all be way more performant, it will be way more scalable, and also it will be more secure because you're reducing the chances of leaking certain information that you do not want to leak. So now that you know all of this stuff and you're comfortable with it, I'm sure all of your future applications are going to be way more optimized and better performing. And now that we have covered this, I highly recommend you to browse through the channel, find something else that might get your interest, and enjoy the videos. Until the next video, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications. It means a lot to me because it allows me to spread my word to more people. Until the next video, thank you for watching and have an amazing day. Happy coding!